Thank you for auditing Professor Skye's Record Review, the always positive new music review show hosted by a French professor who's about to ask a very provocative question. Can rap music be too positive or too smart? This question came to mind when listening to the new album Miles by Blu and Exile. Now, this album's been recommended to me by several people, in particular on my hip-hop videos. Now, I end up reviewing a lot of alternative hip-hop music. This is not on purpose, okay? I listen to everything. I listen to everything every week. All genres, whatever pops up on Tidal, I listen to it. And it just happens to be that alternative hip-hop is very interesting, and I have a lot to say about it as someone who loves rap music. If you watch my video from last week on Marlowe, I'll put up a link up there, you'll see I've had my issues with this genre, in particular with the concept that there is a real hip-hop and a fake hip-hop. But I've never quite put it in this kind of question about whether or not hip-hop can be too positive or too smart. Does the realness, the rawness of an art form created and perfected by people from the lowest possible economic rung in America, primarily African Americans, rising up from obscurity and from being put down by society, can that music, if it's very positive, is it therefore not authentic? Is this very raw music from the streets, is it less authentic when it is very smart, when it sounds very educated, when it makes references to people like Miles Davis or Langston Hughes? The answer, of course, is no. It's ridiculous. Of course rap can be positive. Of course it can be smart. The strength of hip-hop music, especially now that it is the most powerful cultural force in the entire world, is that it doesn't have to be one thing. Now, when I was younger, I remember really feeling put off by rap music when I felt that it was too positive and too smart. In particular, it's interesting, I'm tempted to compare this band to Gang Starr, a rap group that has a duo, and they reminded me of, this Blu and Exile reminded me of Gang Starr because the production is a little bit like DJ Premier, a lot of like scratching, a lot of sampling and putting together little sound collages for a chorus. And the rapper's flow reminds me a fair amount of Guru, and his subject matter, and the way that he's very positive and doesn't rap about crime and drugs and many other things which are cliches of the hip-hop genre. But actually, when thinking about my initial reaction, because I first heard this and was like, no way, this is corny, this is just too happy. This is too happy and just two references to Langston Hughes, two songs about Miles Davis. This isn't real hip-hop. The time I think about that the most is actually as a French hip-hop scholar. The most famous French hip-hop artist is a guy named MC Solar, who I've never liked. I've never liked him because his style is so jazzy and his wordplay is always treated by people who don't like hip-hop as better than hip-hop. It's not like this. It's better because he raps about Rambo, because he raps in a style that's very sophisticated and the music is very jazzy. Interestingly, his early work was all produced by one person, Jimmy J as well. So there is a fair number of parallels here. But over time, as I've come to study MC Solar, and I'll be talking about him probably later in the year, I realized I was just wrong. That my view that the real French hip-hop that I liked, the stuff from the streets, was no more valid. His life experience was the same as them. But the way that he chose to present his artistic expression of growing up in those experiences, in that case, somebody growing up poor on the outskirts of Paris and the child of immigrants. In this case, someone growing up in Los Angeles in a lower middle class working family, growing up black in America. They express it in this way. And just because they do does not make it less valid or less interesting. It ultimately becomes almost a question of taste. Now, if I had to really criticize this album on one thing, I would say that it's too long, like everywhere. Like the 20 songs, it's just too many. I'm actually going to skip the first 4 tracks on this album in my review. I just decided I had to do it because I can't do all 20. I can't do the Skye treatment for all 20 tracks. Plus, they're very dense. And at times, what a lot of what makes this album so great is this Gangstar, MC Solar-esque production and rapper mix, where you have a producer who's doing great, very jazzy production, very maximalist, like a little bit like Marlowe actually last week, where just when you think a song's over, he'll put in a whole nother part. But then it feels quite often like just one more time with the chorus, really? One more time, another verse, maybe go back a little bit on that. But still, it has a very full feeling. The whole album feels so unbelievably rich in terms of its lyricism, in terms of its production. The production itself, there's like very few synthetic instruments on the whole album. Like most samples are from jazz, so you have like horns or piano or guitar, even some scratching. I will also say that it seems to be there's a cultural moment happening here. Now that I've been doing this for 2 years, right? Where a lot of alternative hip hop has what I think we could call is checkerboard, is two-tone. So ska in England in the late 70s, early 80s was often called checkerboard or two-tone, referring to the fact that there were black musicians and white musicians working together as equals for the first time in British music history. Hip-hop is doing that in a way which is unbelievably, I would say it's new. The level to which there's excellent hip-hop being made, and the relationship between usually a white producer, a white DJ, and a black rapper or MC is one of equals. It's symbiotic, but not parasitic. And so much for the history of the relationships between African Americans and white Americans, black and white, is usually not one of equals. And it seems as though there's just an explosion. An explosion. I mean, just think about in the last year. I did a little in my head, I went through examples of this kind of checkerboard two-tone production. You have Czarface, you have Marlowe from last week, you have anything by The Alchemist, anything by Kenny Beats, even Griselda has 3 rappers and then 1 producer. And I think it shows the vitality and the strength of hip-hop. And I'm not saying it's post-racial, because that's a ridiculous thing to say, but it is moving race in popular culture in a more interesting way. Now that there's more acceptance of different producers from different backgrounds coming together and making music, I think it's making hip-hop richer and further cementing what I said already once in this video, that hip-hop is the most vital cultural movement in the world. And so it's attracting everybody. And it's a good thing that it does. And that's what we're going to be studying today, Blu and Exile, the album Miles. Now, I said there's 2 tracks about Miles Davis. There's 5 tracks through the word blue. You might think that's what the whole album is about, but it's not really. To get a clue of what the album's about, I'll have to show you the cover. You see the cover there? There's the 2 guys. I can't tell which one's which from this distance, but you see how they're on top of a tree with a lot of roots. This album is about roots. It's about memories and it's about roots. Musical roots, poetical roots, family roots, and that's part of the positivity that's here. But it's not gratuitous positivity. You don't get the sense that everything they remember is just happy going to Chuck E. Cheese and being a billionaire, right? Their upbringing is difficult, but they're celebrating it in this positive way. And who says hip-hop can't do that? So what I want to do is I want to jump ahead to the 4th track, like I said, the track Feelings, because this is a really good example of the kind of music that they make. It has a very nice piano sample on here, very uplifting, just makes you happy, makes you smile. And the whole song is about feelings and the importance of feeling feelings and the importance and how feelings can be difficult and the places that they take you. And it's not something that you usually associate with a lot of hip-hop production. It's not entirely rosy. He says, when there's police killing children and you have the nerve to ask me how I'm feeling, it's an ambiguous relationship towards feelings. And in here, he actually raps a lot about being poor, about not being able to provide for his own children, which is a theme throughout the entire album. So again, it's a different take, as opposed to being I started from nothing and now I'm a super millionaire. It's I started from nothing and now I still don't still don't have anything. But here's some happy rap music. All right, let's listen to a little bit of the song "The Feeling" by Blu and Exile. You can hear that kind of DJ Premier style mixing there. The guitar. Do you know how happy it is? Like, you just sort of want to like walk down the street, like smiling, like. I'll give you a sense of his flow here as he raps.
The feeling is true, real, something you can feel. The feeling is deeper than any rapper's record deal. The feeling is the healings, not the killing. The feeling is one of the reasons I'm still living, but.
I hope it gives you an idea of how they sound and what they're like. The end has this great bit where I think it's like a poet, Jacinto Rines. I don't know how you say his name. I don't know what he is, but he appears on this album a couple of times, and he makes the album way better because he's just sounds like an old guy who's maybe missing a few teeth. And he's just talking about the feelings, and he goes on and on and on. And this is an example where it could be too long, but it's not. It's not too long. It's just a beautiful song where he just talks about feelings and the nature of feelings, and you're sitting here listening to like an 8-minute rap song, and all you're doing is thinking about feelings. It's an impressive piece of art. A little kind of funny story to talk about the differences between rap. So the Dr. and Mrs. Paine, we were listening to this album together. That's my wife, and she's very, very smart. English is not her first language, it's Serbian, but her English is so good that when I write an article to get published in a journal, she's the one who edits my work. That is how good her English is. But the funny thing is with hip-hop, she can't tell what anyone is saying. So while we were listening to this, there's a quote from Prodigy, from Mobb Deep. And the quote is, "More real than any words can muster." But she heard it as more real than any worms canned mustard. And so she thought it was this really psychedelic, weird line about worms and canned mustard. And I say this because that got me thinking, I'm going to do a little experiment about like the concept that there's like real hip hop and then there's like super happy, positive stuff. I'll play some Mobb Deep for her. Theoretically, the opposite of whatever Blu and Exile is, because I played her, Shook Ones, the easiest song to get attached to, all about being a crook and being shot and shooting people and dying and just Queensbridge murderers. You heard of us? Right? The opposite of what Blu and Exile is. And I played it for her, and she just said, "Yeah, I don't really see any difference." And that was kind of a fun check for me. Because somebody who hasn't grown up with hip-hop, someone who hasn't studied it extensively, it's not that different. Ultimately, it's a similar soundscape. It's people from a position in life in which they are traditionally ignored by the larger society, having a voice and expressing themselves. The differences are ultimately superficial. The differences between hip-hop ultimately are superficial. So why not? Why not have Blu and Exile and Mobb Deep at the same time? They're not as different as snobby, edgelord young Skye would have thought 20 years ago. Poor MC Solar. So then the next track is called Music Is My Life. And if you want to talk about something that's just overly positive and just like seems way too saccharine, that's a song like this. I mean, he's talking about how growing up, all he loved was hip hop, and like his favorite album was Bad, but not by Michael Jackson, by LL Cool J, which is a better album than the album by Michael Jackson. And he even talks about, his other favorite was Wild Wild West and Kool Moe Dee, which is funny because Kool Moe Dee and LL Cool J, like, they don't get along. This is like one of the great rap beefs of all history. But it's this like cool kind of like going back and forth and talking about the history. And I was starting to get annoyed, but then the next verse makes it more interesting. He talks about his life and getting a stepdad who's overly religious, and he actually sort of recontextualizes this journey. So it's not just like, hey, remember Crisscross when they wore their pants backwards? Wait a minute, my t-shirt's inside out. Hey, I'm Crisscross. Hey, remember when they used to do that? No. Right? Like, it's not just about that. It's not just a member berry sandwich. It's actually a very interesting song about his journey, which is then followed by the next track, Bright as Stars, which has kind of a Stevie Wonder style musical backdrop. And it's talking about growing up in poverty, looking up to rappers, and starting off as kind of like a gangster rapper, but then realizing that's not him. That's not him, and that what he has to be, as we'll see, is someone much more positive. Then a couple more tracks about Blue. The first track was called Blue. I'm not going to talk about it. But this one, Blue as I Can Be, has some more samples. The rapper is talking about blueness, Eminem and Mos Def. Again, some more like jazz references here. It got a little bit boring. But then we get to the next track, You Ain't Never Been Blue. Probably my highlight of this album. Just, if you have, I'm going to put that one in the comments, in the description here. It's just great. It's a little bit more upbeat. The music is, but it's all about growing up poor. And it's also sort of about staying poor and about these difficulties. And it's about this tough life, but it's the best example of Exile's wonderful production and Guru's great flow. You're sleeping two to a bed, one at the foot, one at the headboard. You study to be a college student until your head's sore. You work at a pet store. The illest rapper rapping that ain't gold, ain't platinum, cause I ain't sell my soul for some cracker or mansion. See, just because I'm rapping doesn't mean I'm stacking. And this is an important thing, and something which has been coming up a lot more in hip-hop, that it's hard to provide for your family if you're a rap artist. It's just hard. It's really difficult. It's actually difficult to make money at all as a musician. Next track is another example of, I just wish they could just take a couple of these out and it would just be such a stronger album. Miles Away, it's a kind of song, not particularly good. But the next track, Troubled Water, is cool because it's got kind of a reggae feel, a little bit of a better flow on this album. Just very honest, just again rapping about not being platinum, rapping about not being a very popular rapper. But he can definitely rap. Like, he definitely is a very talented rapper. And at times maybe his word selection or his references can kind of cover that up because it can seem like that's a crutch. But he actually has a really good flow, and I think you hear it here. A cool thing when the production or these like xylophone sounds get louder. Next track, Roots of Blue, has like an African drum sample. We're getting to a little bit of this sort of weird, not back to Africa, but more about the African roots of humanity. And he talks about the path that humanity has taken. And he goes back to like the pyramids and before that, and there's a lot of like anthropology on this album. It's a very anthropological album, which again, should rap really be smart and positive? Yes. Why even ask that question? But that leads really well into the next track, African Dream, another reggae sounding song with some African guitar. It ends with some African drums. And I was like, what is this, the 90s? Is this like 1991? Like, it's all about Africa and about the dream of Africa. But it's important, and I don't know why it disappeared in hip-hop, right? It just disappeared. Like, for 30 years, there's been very few songs about Africa, and there used to be, like, almost one Africa song per album. One thing I like about this in particular is he talks about, like, way old school. They call me Homo habilis because I created the habitat before the great Homo erectus invaded half the map. He could catch a lion, kill it, put his head on a stick just to prove how strong he really is. So there's a real desire here to go to the roots of humanity, not just the roots of his music and his vision. Which then leads quite nicely into Requiem of Blue, which has a really cool... This producer does a lot of great layering, and I wish... Because, this is a first listen review show, I only listened to something a couple times. I get the sense, and you can put it in the comments if you're a super fan of this album, that the production details probably come out. Because there's a layering on this beat that is really good, but it's very subtle. It's cool, kind of like sloppy, like pianos, like the pianos sound like they have like tacks in them, And then it's followed up by The American Dream. So the American Dream coming after the African Dream, and this is cool because it has my favorite lyric on the album. Because like many rappers who are alternative rappers who come across as being super smart and smarter than everybody else, they don't swear. And he doesn't really swear on this album, except for this. So the S word is coming up. I don't like to swear, but anyways. A big fat slice of that American lie. Same dream they sold that made America fly. Into the sky, to the moon, back to Houston. Bullshit. I don't think he's saying that the moon landing didn't happen. I think he's talking about the fact that the American dream is, for many, bullshit. But it's not particularly it's not like a super anti-capitalist song. It's actually not that dark of a song. It's more just talking about the difficulty of this dream and the near impossibility of him to achieve it. Next track, Dear Lord, is basically the song Imagine by John Lennon, but a rap version. And I mean that in a good way and a bad way. To the Fall But Not Forgotten is a really weird song that is a list of dead people. Like, going back a long way. And it's weird. In some ways I hate it, because it's like a in memory of section. But then in some ways I like it, because it's almost like a shout-out song. You know, like back in the day, like Bismarcky again, you know, like shouting at everybody that you love. And this is a really weird thing, where I talked last week about the artist who died that made me realize I was eventually going to die myself. And he mentions him in this video. He mentions Buff Love of the Fat Boys. So I at least got to give him credit. You know, it's not just like Prince died, and Michael Jackson died, and Tom Petty died. It is a little bit that. But also, at least he mentioned Buff Love. I have to admit, I don't know which one is Buff Love. I think that's Buff Love, but I never saw their videos. Although I did watch that movie, Disorderlies. It's a good movie. Another highlight track is next, All the Blues. And this is all about Miles Davis, sort of. So it gives Miles Davis' story. If I was a music professor, I would be all excited to like, oh, so you think Miles Davis is old, How about this rapper singing about Miles Davis? I can just see all my students rolling their eyes. But it's all about, it's like putting forth Miles Davis as being like a true American hero. It's an interesting biography, an awesome groove on this production. I think this album is going to grow on me a lot. And I think that my initial hesitance and denial of rap's possible positivity has cost me something, because it's going to take me a while to catch up to this album. But then, after he talks about Miles Davis, he talks about his grandfather. And it's great. It's all about these roots. And it's about it's about his American story, really. And about getting him there. And then it's about him having a child and naming that child Miles. And it's great, because you feel his fatherhood, you feel his place in his family, and you see it mediated through music. It's really great. The next track is called Spread Sunshine, which is like, it's funny. It's just like, it's all about his goal is to spread positivity. He's like Johnny Appleseed of positivity. I must spread sunshine. But again, it's cool. You keep going, Blue. Like, spread sunshine. You know, it doesn't all have to be depressing. You know, just because you grew up poor and just because you're currently not a millionaire rapper doesn't mean that you can't spread sunshine. The next track, then the final track is The End, which is funny because that's kind of an apocalyptic ending to this whole thing. It's really well made. Maybe my favorite beat on the whole album. Lots of interesting kind of drones here. It's those layers coming on again. But again, just a little too long, a couple too many guest verses. I think All the Blues is my favorite track on this album. I don't know, maybe. Because it's shorter and because it just kind of gets in and gets out. But there you go. There's my review of Blu and Exile. Thank you to those who suggested that I listen to it. Because when it came out 3 weeks ago or a month ago, I just dismissed it. Because it was too positive and too smart. And hip-hop deserves better than being limited to raw and dark. Okay, well, until next time, for Langston Hughes, which if you've never read Langston Hughes, by the way, it's really rewarding. He is a very, very rewarding poet to read. So just do that sometime. Okay, there's the camera.